So when we usually picture these, grand world-shifting moments of scientific discovery, I feel like we tend to imagine well-lit rooms. Like we picture sprawling university libraries, polished wooden desks, maybe a quiet laboratory with gleaming brass instruments.
Right, very pristine.
Exactly, a space that is safe and controlled and occupied by people who hold a whole series of really impressive academic titles. But to understand the sheer magnitude of what we're going to explore in this deep dive, you have to completely shatter that image. I mean, I need you to picture something entirely different.
Yeah, to truly grasp the stakes of this particular discovery,
Yeah.
you have to transport yourself far away from those cozy, wood-paneled studies in London or Paris. Picture the dead of winter on the Dorset coast,
Okay.
right in the early 19th century.
Okay, setting the scene.
It is a freezing, pitch-black night. A brutal winter storm has just battered the coastline, and I mean the kind of violent, churning squall that physically tears the earth apart. The sea is roaring, it's just crashing relentlessly against a stretch of shingle beach. And towering above that beach, looming in the darkness, are these sheer vertical cliffs.
Wow.
But they aren't stable rock. They're wet, crumbling, and actively groaning under their own weight. If you're standing on that beach, you can hear the terrifying crack and hiss of loose shale sliding into the dark, which is a warning of an imminent deadly landslide.
That sounds genuinely terrifying.
It is. This isn't a romantic stroll on the beach, you know. It is a treacherous life-or-death environment where one wrong step or just one unlucky moment means you are crushed under hundreds of tons of falling stone.
And right in the middle of that nightmare, in the freezing cold and the absolute pitch black, there's a 12-year-old girl.
Yeah, a 12-year-old girl out in those deadly hours, entirely alone, wrapped tightly against the freezing wind, and she's holding a small metal hammer.
Just a small hammer against all that.
Right. She is out there because those violent storms are the only mechanism that tears the fresh rock from the cliffs, spilling ancient secrets right onto the beach. The wealthy gentlemen collectors, the academics, they wait for the sun.
Because it's safer.
Exactly. But she doesn't wait. She can't afford to wait. So she is working her way across these treacherous, slippery rocks, listening to the groan of the unstable stone above her, just tapping patiently with her hammer. And then, in the darkness, illuminated maybe by a single, meager lantern, she clears away a layer of heavy mud and shale. And she finds an eye.
Yeah, I.
Not a human eye, but a socket embedded in the stone, perfectly preserved, and it's the size of a saucer.
Okay, let's unpack this, because what you're describing sounds like the opening scene of, I don't know, a dark Gothic thriller, but it is an entirely real, documented historical event. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the life and work of Mary Anning. She was a 19th century working-class girl from a coastal town called Lyme Regis, and she pulled absolute biological marvels out of the earth decades before the word dinosaur was even invented.
Yet, the word literally didn't exist yet.
Right. So our mission today is to explore something really profound. We're going to look at how one marginalized person, completely lacking any formal education, handed humanity the physical, undeniable proof of deep time.
Which is a massive concept.
Huge. We're talking about the dizzying realization that the Earth is inconceivably old and utterly filled with vanished worlds.
It's literally the specific historical moment the human race looked down at the ground and realized it was standing on a stacked, physical library of dead ecosystems. And she was the one who figured out how to read the book.
I love that analogy. And I want to say right up front to you listening, if you have ever felt like an outsider looking into a closed elite system, or if you simply love the thrill of that massive aha moment that completely rewrites your understanding of reality, this deep dive is going to stay with you.
It really is an unbelievable story.
It is. So we have this striking atmospheric hook. We have this 12-year-old girl on a terrifying beach with a saucer-sized eye staring back at her from the stone. But we need to understand the mechanics of this situation. I mean, why is a child out in the deadly hours of a winter storm in the first place?
Well, to understand the why, you have to understand the geology of the setting, because it dictates everything that happens to her. Lyme Regis is defined by the Blue Lias Cliffs. Now, the Blue Lias is geologically astonishing. It is a formation of alternating bands of limestone and shale.
Okay, limestone and shale.
Right. Millions of years ago, during the early Jurassic period, this entire area was a warm, shallow sea. When marine animals died, they sank to the bottom. And because the bottom of this specific sea was anoxic, meaning it lacked oxygen, scavengers couldn't survive down there to eat the carcasses.
Oh, so nothing is down there breaking the bodies apart.
Exactly. The normal processes of decay were halted. The animals were rapidly buried in fine mud, which over millions of years compressed into shale and limestone. So these cliffs are essentially a vertical, highly compressed stack of 200 million years of pristine biological history.
That is wild. I'm trying to picture the physical reality of extracting anything from that, though. It's not like digging in loose sand, right? You're dealing with solid rock that is fiercely protective of that history.
Precisely. The cliffs only yield their treasures through violent erosion. They don't just gently offer up fossils for you to pick up. The winter storms, combined with the freeze-thaw cycle, where water gets into the cracks of the rock, freezes, expands, and then shatters the stone, that causes massive, deadly landslides.
Right, because ice expands.
Yeah. And the ocean is constantly chewing on the bottom of the cliffs, undercutting them, until gravity does the rest, and sheer vertical sheets of rock just come crashing down. So to go fossil hunting there requires navigating an active hazard zone. You're racing the tides, and you're racing the other scavengers.
It's essentially a geological war zone. And into this active hazard zone walks the Anning family. Let's break down their socioeconomic reality because it completely dictates why they are risking their lives out there. The historical records tell us the Annings were poor, and they were also dissenters.
Yeah, that single word, dissenter, really defined the structural limits of their existence. In 19th century England, being a dissenter meant you did not belong to the Church of England. You belonged to a different Protestant sect, and in their case, they were Congregationalists.
Okay, which seems like a minor thing today.
Right. Today, we might think of that as a simple difference in weekly worship. But under the Test Acts and the social structures of the era, it immediately barred you from much of respectable society. It meant you were institutionally sidelined.
Wow.
Yeah, dissenters couldn't attend the major universities like Oxford or Cambridge. They were excluded from holding civil or military office, and they were heavily socially segregated.
So they are structurally locked out of upward mobility from day one. I mean, you can't just study your way out of poverty if the universities won't even legally let you through the door.
Exactly.
And the father of the family, Richard Anning, is a cabinet maker. That's his primary trade. But making cabinets in a small seaside town isn't quite paying the bills, is it?
Not at all. Especially not during the Napoleonic Wars. The economic context is super fascinating here. Because of the wars with France, wealthy British citizens couldn't safely take their traditional grand tour of continental Europe.
Oh, because they'd be traveling through a war zone.
Right. So they started vacationing domestically instead. Seaside towns like Lyme Regis saw an influx of wealthy tourists looking for fresh air and picturesque landscapes. Richard Anning realized he could supplement his meager cabinet-making income by walking those deadly cliffs and selling what they called curiosities to these tourists.
Let's clarify that term, curiosities, because they weren't calling them fossils in the scientific sense we use today, right?
Correct.
Like, they didn't really understand the biological origins of what they were holding.
For the most part, no, they didn't. They were seen as oddities of nature, almost like geological jokes or flukes. They found snake stones, which were actually ammonites, those beautiful spiral shells. They found devil's toenails.
Devil's toenails.
Yeah, which were an extinct type of oyster called Gryphea. They found random vertebrate fragments. These were just little curios to put on a mantelpiece, a neat souvenir of a trip to the sea. Richard Anning would take his children, Mary and her brother Joseph, out onto the beach to help him find these curiosities to sell for a few extra shillings from a table outside their home.
Before we get to the primary catalyst that forces Mary out into the dark alone, we have to touch on this incredible piece of local lore about her childhood. Now, we have to explicitly frame this as reported legend, not a hard, documented scientific fact, but it provides such a vivid window into how the local community viewed her. The accounts note a story that when Mary was an infant, she survived a lightning strike.
Yeah, the legend goes that in 1800, a local woman was holding the infant Mary Anning while standing under an elm tree with two other women. They were watching an equestrian show during a sudden summer storm, and lightning struck the tree.
That's terrifying.
The electrical discharge killed the three adults instantly, but the baby survived. And the local lore of Lyme Regis insisted that before the strike, Mary was a sickly, fragile infant, but afterward, she became incredibly quick, intensely curious, and remarkably lively.
I find the timing of that myth so interesting. I mean, this is the era when electricity is the absolute cutting edge of scientific fascination. You have Galvani experimenting with electrical currents and frog legs, this idea of electricity as a vital animating life force.
Like Frankenstein, essentially.
Exactly. So the local community essentially frames her origin story around this immense electrical baptism. It perfectly encapsulates how extraordinary and almost otherworldly her intelligence seemed to the people around her as she grew up.
It's a very powerful narrative framing. But that quick intelligence, that liveliness, was very abruptly forced into a crucible of sheer, brutal survival, because in 1810, the bottom completely falls out of her world. When Mary is just 11 years old, her father, Richard, dies.
Oh, wow, only 11.
Yeah, he had a history of tuberculosis, and he'd also suffered a severe injury in a fall from those very cliffs while hunting for curiosities. He leaves the family in massive, insurmountable debt.
So we're not talking about a family that just has to tighten its belt or skip a few meals. We are talking about a family facing imminent starvation and the very real threat of the Victorian workhouse.
Which was a death sentence in its own right.
Absolutely. This completely changes the entire context of the deep dive. Finding fossils was no longer a quaint hobby for the Annings, and it wasn't just a way to get a few extra shillings for luxuries. It was rent. It was bread. It was the literal difference between life and death.
Stripping away the romanticism we usually attach to scientific discovery is crucial right here. Mary wasn't seeking to rewrite biology. She wasn't trying to make a name for herself in the annals of geology. She was desperately seeking a way to keep her family alive, so she and her brother Joseph take over the family business of scouring the beach. And that leads us directly to the year 1811.
This brings us back to that incredible moment on the beach. Around 1811, Mary's brother Joseph is on the cliffs, and he spots a massive skull embedded in the rock. But it is Mary, who is only 12 years old at the time, who dedicates herself to extracting the rest of this creature. And I want to understand the physical mechanics of this. How does a child safely extract a massive, fragile fossil from heavy stone on an active tidal beach?
It requires a level of physical endurance and technical precision that is just difficult to overstate. Shale is essentially highly compressed mud. If you hit it with a heavy iron hammer in the wrong spot, the shock wave travels through the rock and shatters the fossilized bone inside.
So you ruin the very thing you're trying to save.
Exactly. Plus, Mary had to work within the tidal windows, meaning she only had a few hours a day before the freezing ocean covered the site again.
The pressure is insane.
Right. She would use small chisels and hammers, painstakingly chipping away the matrix millimeter by millimeter. Once a section was exposed, she had to protect it from the elements, often using animal glues or waxes to stabilize the crumbling bone before carefully extracting the heavy blocks of stone to haul all the way back to her workshop.
So she spends months out there in these dangerous conditions, battling the tides, fighting the winter weather, doing this highly technical extraction. And what she pulls out of the cliff isn't just a handful of interesting shells. It is a 17-foot-long sea creature.
It's massive.
It has a long snout full of teeth, huge eye sockets containing reinforced bony rings, and a body that looks like a bizarre cross between a dolphin and a crocodile. It becomes the first complete, scientifically recognized ichthyosaur.
And those bony rings you mentioned, the sclerotic rings inside the eye sockets, they are a perfect example of the biomechanical marvels she was uncovering. We now know those rings exist to reinforce the eyeball against immense water pressure, indicating this creature was a deep-sea diver.
That's incredible.
At the time, though, it was simply an incomprehensible monster. She sells the skeleton to a local lord for 23 pounds, which was enough to keep the family afloat for a little while, and it eventually makes its way to the British Museum.
Finding a 17-foot ancient marine predator is an incredible feat, but I want to reframe how we view paleontology based on this. As we mentioned at the start, we usually picture this as a dusty academic pursuit. But for Mary, this is extreme blue-collar labor. It is physically punishing.
Very punishing.
It's akin to being an offshore crab fisherman in the Bering Sea today. You are racing against the elements, you are freezing, you know the environment could crush you at any moment, and you are doing it just to secure your next meal.
Yeah, the physical toll was immense. But the intellectual leap is what separates Mary Anning from a mere beachcomber. Finding one giant skeleton could, if you're being extremely ungenerous, be written off as a lucky fluke. You know, gravity eventually drops something amazing in your lap if you walk the beach long enough.
Right, eventually you stumble on something.
But what she did next proves she was a scientific genius hiding in plain sight. She didn't just hack bones out of rocks and hand them off to wealthy men to figure out. She built an incredibly unlikely self-taught expertise.
I'm fascinated by how she actually acquired this knowledge. She has essentially no formal schooling. She's not allowed in the universities. How does a working-class teenager in the 1810s become a world-class anatomist?
She did it through sheer, relentless force of will and observation. She would borrow scientific papers from the gentlemen who came to buy her fossils. Since she couldn't afford to buy the journals herself, she would painstakingly copy them out by hand.
Oh, wow. Word for word.
Word for word. She copied the text, And more importantly, she meticulously copied the complex anatomical drawings, learning the precise language and framework of the science.
She is basically running her own private candlelit university in a drafty cottage. And she realizes that reading isn't enough, right? If she wants to understand these ancient creatures, she needs to understand how living biology works.
Exactly. She engaged in rigorous comparative anatomy. She realized that to make sense of a 200-million-year-old fossilized flipper, she needed to know how a modern flipper was constructed. So she started dissecting modern animals.
Just on her kitchen table.
Pretty much. She dissected fish, she dissected cuttlefish and squid. She learned anatomy from the inside out, studying homologous structures, how the musculature and skeletal structure of things swimming in the ocean today mapped onto the bone structures of the things she was pulling out of the stone.
That is the crucial pivot from a collector to a scientist. She isn't just looking at the outside of a rock, she is reverse engineering the biomechanics of an extinct ecosystem. And her anatomical intuition became so precise that the power dynamics of her world began to subtly shift.
I absolutely did.
The leading geologists and anatomists of Europe began traveling down to Lyme Regis not just to purchase specimens from a vendor, but to consult with her on the anatomy.
Because they recognized her unparalleled eye. She could look at a jumble of bones embedded in a slab of rock and accurately predict what the rest of the skeleton would look like, guiding the preparation process in ways that university-educated men simply couldn't.
This incredible self-taught expertise sets the stage for one of the greatest intellectual showdowns in the history of 19th century science. Let's fast forward to 1823. Mary makes another staggering discovery. She finds the first complete plesiosaur. And the biomechanics of this creature are so absurd that it triggers an international incident.
Yeah, if the ichthyosaur was weird, the plesiosaur was viewed as entirely impossible. It was a bizarre, almost comical creature. It had a tiny reptilian head, an impossibly long snake-like neck containing 35 to 40 vertebrae, a barrel-shaped torso, and 4 large paddle-like flippers.
That sounds completely made up.
When you look at the skeleton, it looks like a chimera. It looks as though someone took spare parts from a turtle, a snake, and a lizard and just glued them together.
And that is exactly what one very powerful man thought it was. Enter Georges Cuvier. Why was Cuvier so certain, without even seeing the physical fossil in person, that it was fake? What was his scientific reasoning?
Well, Georges Cuvier was the towering, internationally renowned French anatomist of his era. He'd built his reputation and essentially founded the field of modern paleontology on a principle he called the correlation of parts. This was his ironclad scientific law.
Okay, the correlation of parts.
Yes, the correlation of parts states that an animal's anatomical features are deeply interdependent based on its lifestyle and diet.
Right, so if you find a skull with flat, grinding teeth, it belongs to an herbivore. And an herbivore will have a specific type of jaw joint and a specific type of digestive tract, and it certainly won't have the sharp, retracting claws of a predator. The parts must correlate logically.
Precisely. Cuvier boasted that he could take a single fossilized tooth or a single bone fragment and accurately reconstruct the entire animal because the rules of biology dictated what the rest of the animal had to look like. So when Cuvier saw a sketch of Mary Anning's newly discovered plesiosaur, it fundamentally violated his law of the correlation of parts.
Because you have this massive, powerful, barrel-chested marine body, which suggests a fast-moving aquatic predator. But attached to it is this delicate, impossibly long neck with a tiny head. Mechanically, it just doesn't make sense to him. If it swims fast, the water resistance would snap that thin neck.
Exactly. It broke the rules of biomechanics as Cuvier understood them. Furthermore, reptiles generally have around 3 to 8 neck vertebrae. Birds can have more, like a swan. But this creature had upwards of 40 neck vertebrae.
40? That's ridiculous.
It is. Cuvier looked at the drawing and immediately declared it a forgery. He stated it was physically impossible for an animal to exist with that anatomy. He essentially accused the finder of gluing extra bones from different animals together to make a more spectacular and expensive curiosity to sell to gullible Englishmen.
Let's really look at the power dynamics of this moment because it is staggering. On one side, you have a teenage girl, a dissenter, a working-class woman living in poverty in Dorset. She is the one who is actually out in the freezing rain. She is the one who painstakingly chipped the matrix away. She has her hands on the physical, undeniable evidence.
Right, the actual fossil.
On the other side, you have a globally famous, incredibly wealthy nobleman sitting in a comfortable office in Paris who has only seen a drawing. And yet, the burden of proof is entirely on her. He gets to default to calling her a liar, risking her entire livelihood based purely on his theoretical framework. It raises a massive question for me about how scientific progress functions.
How do you mean?
Well, if the evidence contradicts the reigning theory, the establishment's first instinct is often to attack the credibility of the person providing the evidence, especially if they are the wrong kind of person.
The structural hierarchy of credibility in 19th century science was incredibly rigid. A gentleman's word was his bond. A working-class merchant was presumed to be a hustler prone to exaggeration or outright fraud. Cuvier's accusation was incredibly dangerous to the Annings.
Because it would ruin their business.
Entirely. Their whole economic survival depended on their reputation for selling genuine, high-quality specimens. If Cuvier's verdict stood, they would be ruined. No collector would buy from them again.
So how does this resolve? The physical fossil is in England, Cuvier's in France, saying it's a fake.
A special emergency meeting is convened at the Geological Society in London in early 1824 to examine the specimen and debate its authenticity. Mary Anning, the person who discovered it, excavated it, and prepared it, is of course barred from attending because she is a woman, naturally. But the specimen itself is examined meticulously by the leading geologists of Britain, including William Buckland.
And what do they find when they actually look at the rock?
The physical evidence is undeniable. When you examine a fossil in its matrix, you can see if it has been tampered with. The rock surrounding the bones of the plesiosaur was unbroken. There were no glue marks, no tool marks suggesting bones were inserted, no signs of tampering whatsoever. The skeleton was perfectly articulated exactly as it had died and been buried in the mud millions of years ago.
So they have to admit she's right.
The findings are relayed to Cuvier, and to his credit as a scientist, when confronted with the irrefutable physical proof, he publicly concedes. He admits the specimen is genuine. A shopkeeper's daughter in Dorset was right about the anatomy of an impossible creature, and the greatest anatomist in the world had to revise his scientific laws.
It is an incredible vindication of her observational brilliance, and she doesn't stop there. The records show she goes on a decades-long hot streak of discoveries that continually reshape the scientific landscape. In 1828, she finds something that takes paleontology out of the ocean and puts it into the sky.
Yet, she discovers the first pterosaur ever found in Britain, later named Dimorphodon macronix. Until then, flying reptiles had only been found in the limestone quarries of Germany.
I'm trying to imagine the shock of that. You've just accepted there are giant marine reptiles. But now, Mary Anning chips away at a rock in Dorset and pulls out a flying dragon. A creature with a massive head, sharp teeth, and wings made of skin stretching from elongated fingers.
The biomechanics of the pterosaur were just as confounding as the plesiosaur. It forced scientists to grapple with the mechanics of vertebrate flight millions of years before birds evolved. But Mary's eye for detail yielded marvels that went beyond just the giant, spectacular skeletons. She changed how we understand the process of fossilization itself.
This is one of my favorite details about her work. It involves ancient squid.
Yes, the belemnites. Belemnites were ancient, extinct relatives of modern squid and cuttlefish. Because of her work dissecting modern cuttlefish, Mary knew exactly where their ink sacs were located within their anatomy.
From doing those dissections at home.
Exactly. When she was excavating fossilized belemnites, she noticed small, dark, carbonized lumps inside the body cavities of the fossils, right where the ink sac should be.
So she theorizes that the ink itself fossilized, that the biochemical material survived for hundreds of millions of years.
Exactly, and the preservation in that anoxic blue lias mud was so perfect that her friend, a local fossil collector and artist named Elizabeth Philpott, could actually take those 200-million-year-old fossilized ink sacs, grind them up, mix them with water, and revive the ancient ink. She used it to draw illustrations of the very fossils they were finding.
We need to pause on that. You are drawing a scientifically accurate anatomical diagram of an extinct creature, using the literal biochemical ink that exact creature produced to defend itself in a Jurassic ocean. It is a profound, almost poetic intersection of art, biology, and deep time.
It is a stunning realization of how much information is actually preserved in the rock. And building on that hyper-observant eye, she solved another mystery that had been puzzling geologists. They kept finding these strange conical, sometimes spiral-shaped stones inside the abdominal regions of the fossilized ichthyosaurs.
What did they think they were?
Some thought they were just odd pebbles the animals swallowed for ballast. But Mary Anning, working alongside geologist William Buckland, made a crucial intuitive leap.
She realizes these aren't just rocks.
Right, she realizes they are coprolites, fossilized feces.
The fossilized poop.
Yes, fossilized poop. Because of her detailed extraction work, she noticed these stones were always found in the exact location of the animal's intestinal tract.
So we have fossilized sea monster dung, but why is this scientifically important? Why does geologists care about ancient feces?
Because of their chemical composition and what is trapped inside them, coprolites are rich in calcium phosphate. When Buckland and Anning began breaking these coprolites open, they found fragments of fish scales, tiny bones, and the remains of smaller marine reptiles.
Wait, so this completely changes the scope of the science. Up until this point, finding a fossil was like finding an isolated statue. You have a dead animal in a rock, but by analyzing the coprolites, you are suddenly looking at a dynamic, interactive system.
Precisely. For the first time, humanity wasn't just looking at isolated dead animals. They were looking at an ecosystem. They were unlocking a way to read whole vanished food chains. They could prove that the giant ichthyosaurs ate the smaller fish and sometimes ate smaller ichthyosaurs.
That's amazing.
She essentially resurrected a Jurassic food web using the preserved biochemical signatures of the animals themselves.
So we have the sea dragons, the flying reptiles, the revived ancient ink, the fossilized ecosystems. This brings us to a massive conceptual pivot. The physical bones that Mary was pulling out of the earth were awe-inspiring, but the intellectual explosion they caused fundamentally altered human philosophy. Because these fossils weren't just neat oddities for rich guys' cabinets, they were ticking time bombs for the entire contemporary worldview.
To appreciate the magnitude of this intellectual explosion, we have to deeply understand the prevailing philosophy of the early 19th century. The default belief in the Western world, the intellectual air everyone breathed, was the concept of a young Earth, heavily influenced by the Ussher chronology.
Bishop Ussher, who in the 17th century calculated the exact date of creation based on the genealogies in the Bible, right? He concluded the Earth was created on October 23, 4004 BC.
Exactly. So the prevailing scientific and cultural consensus was that the Earth was roughly 6,000 years old. Furthermore, there was a deeply held philosophical belief, rooted in theology, of a fixed, finished, and perfect creation, often called the Great Chain of Being. God had created all the animals perfectly adapted to their environments.
But nothing changes.
Because God's creation was perfect, no species could ever be lost. The idea of extinction implied that God had made a mistake, or that the design was flawed.
The assumption was that every animal ever created was still alive out there somewhere. If you found a strange bone in Europe, the assumption was, oh, that animal probably just lives in some unexplored jungle in South America or deep in the Pacific Ocean. The idea that a species could just wipe out and vanish was considered philosophically unacceptable and honestly bordering on blasphemous.
Now, we must carefully distinguish Mary Anning's specific role in dismantling this worldview. It is a common simplification in popular history to claim that Mary Anning theorized extinction or that she discovered evolution. She did not.
Right, that wasn't her project.
The theoretical concept of extinction was being championed by Georges Cuvier, who proposed catastrophism, the idea that localized violent floods or disasters wiped out certain species. And Charles Darwin's framework for evolution on the origins of species wouldn't be published until 1859, which was a dozen years after Mary's death.
Right. She wasn't writing the philosophical treatises on population dynamics or natural selection, but what she provided was arguably more dangerous to the establishment and more vital to the new science.
She provided the irrefutable physical data. You can argue endlessly with a philosophical treatise on whether a species theoretically could go extinct. You cannot argue with a completely articulated 17-foot stone skeleton of a marine reptile that breathes air but lives in the ocean, which clearly does not exist anywhere on the modern mapped Earth.
It's right there in front of you.
Her spectacular, complete skeletons were the hard, undeniable proof that entire, complex orders of life had ruled the planet and then vanished entirely. You can't hide a plesiosaur in an unexplored jungle.
She gave them the monsters. And in doing so, she forced the scientific establishment to confront the concept of deep time. I'm trying to think of an analogy for how shocking this was. Imagine discovering that the foundation of your house doesn't just go down a few feet into the dirt, but extends downward for millions of miles, and every sub-basement is filled with the bizarre artifacts of civilizations you never knew existed.
That's a great way to put it.
The sheer cosmic vertigo of realizing that the history you were taught is just the thinnest coat of paint on a structure that is incomprehensibly vast. That is what Mary Anning handed humanity regarding the dimension of time. She proved that the ground beneath our feet is a stacked library of dead worlds, layered one on top of the other, going back hundreds of millions of years.
The psychological vertigo of that realization cannot be overstated. Geologists like William Buckland and Charles Lyell, who championed uniformitarianism, the idea of slow, gradual geological change, were using Mary's exact fossils to formulate these theories of a staggeringly ancient Earth. This fundamentally destabilized a literal fundamentalist reading of the Book of Genesis.
Which introduces a profound and deeply complex tension in Mary Anning's life.
Right.
We have to look at this impartially as a matter of historical record, but the paradox here is stunning. Mary Anning herself was a deeply devout religious woman.
She was. She remained a pious dissenter for most of her life, later transitioning to the Church of England. She read her Bible, she attended chapel, she was deeply integrated into the religious life of her community.
It's quite a contrast.
Yet the very fossils she was painstakingly carving out of the cliffside, the physical labor she dedicated her life to in order to survive, provided the exact pieces of evidence being used by the scientific elite in London to dismantle the literal interpretation of the creation story she grew up with.
It's a massive cognitive and theological burden to carry. She is physically unearthing the tools that are dismantling her own era's religious certainty. Whether she personally reconciled that tension by viewing deep time as evidence of God's majesty, or whether it caused her internal conflict, her work was so vivid, so undeniable, that the public couldn't just read about it in dry academic journals anymore. They needed to conceptually visualize it. Which leads us to humanity's first attempt to actually picture this newly discovered deep time.
In 1830, a geologist and childhood friend of Mary's named Henry de la Beche created a watercolor painting called Duria Antiquae, which translates to a more ancient Dorset. This is a monumental landmark moment in the history of science communication.
Why is it so monumental?
It is widely considered the very first pictorial reconstruction of a prehistoric ecosystem.
I'm trying to picture how someone in 1830 even begins to draw a prehistoric world when the concept of dinosaurs doesn't even exist yet. Are they just drawing mythological monsters, or is it biologically grounded?
It is deeply biologically grounded, but it is wonderfully chaotic and violent. De la Beche didn't just paint isolated animals. He painted a teeming, brutal marine ecosystem. You have ichthyosaurs actively snapping their jaws into the long necks of plesiosaurs.
Oh, wow, really leaning into the drama.
You have pterosaurs flying overhead, belemnites swimming in the depths, and staying true to the science, you even have giant fossilized feces actively dropping to the seafloor from the battling reptiles.
It sounds incredibly dynamic. It's not a static museum diorama. It's a living, breathing, dying world.
Exactly. And what is crucial to understand is that almost every single creature depicted in that groundbreaking painting, every biological interaction shown, was based entirely on the specific fossil discoveries of Mary Anning. De la Beche had lithographic prints made of this painting and sold them, specifically giving the proceeds to Mary to help support her financially.
Because she was still struggling.
Yes, despite her international fame, she was constantly struggling to survive.
Which brings us to the hardest part of our deep dive. We've established her world-altering contributions. She found the impossible biology. She provided the irrefutable evidence for extinction. Her discoveries birthed the visual concept of deep time and ecological reconstruction. So how did the society she lived in repay her for this monumental labor?
The society repaid her by constantly enforcing the three insurmountable walls of her era. We mentioned them briefly at the beginning, but they define the absolute limits of her existence. She was working class, she was a religious dissenter, and she was a woman.
Those are three massive strikes in 19th century Britain. If you have any one of those, your life is difficult. If you have all three, you are entirely boxed out of the institutional power structure.
Completely. The Geological Society of London, which was the epicenter of the new, exciting science of paleontology, flat out refused to admit women as members. In fact, that ban on female members lasted until 1904.
That is just wild to think about, 1904.
Right. Because she was a woman and not a member, she could not publish her findings in their scientific journals under her own name. She couldn't even enter the physical room to hear the debates about the very bones she had excavated with her own hands.
The theft of intellectual credit here is staggering, and it's rooted in how science functioned at the time. Science wasn't a paid profession, it was a gentleman's pursuit. It relied on patronage and personal wealth. The gentlemen who bought her fossils, the ones who could afford the carriage ride to Dorset, buy a skeleton for £50 and transport it back to London, would then write the academic papers describing the creatures.
Taking all the credit.
Right. They would debate the biomechanics, they would officially name the species, and frequently they would fail to even mention Mary Anning's name in their publications. They absorbed her physical labor, her physical risk on those cliffs, and her immense anatomical insight into their own academic reputations.
They largely treated her as a commercial vendor of raw geological materials rather than a scientific colleague. Her intellectual knowledge was extracted along with the fossils. And because she was denied the prestige, the titles, and the institutional support of a professional scientist, her living remained incredibly precarious.
She never gets financially secure.
No. Despite changing human understanding of the planet forever, she remained essentially destitute for much of her life, relying on unpredictable fossil finds to pay the rent.
There is a specific story in the historical records about her friend, Thomas Birch, that highlights just how close to the edge the Annings lived.
Yes. Thomas Birch was a wealthy fossil collector and a friend of the family. Around 1820, the Anning family was so deeply in debt and facing such dire financial ruin that they were contemplating selling their furniture just to buy food.
That's heartbreaking.
Birch actually stepped in and auctioned off his own personal collection of fossils, many of which he had bought from Mary, giving the proceeds, about £400, to the Annings, just to save them from starvation and eviction. Decades later, the geologist William Buckland had to aggressively lobby the British government to secure her a small civil list pension, just so the greatest fossil hunter in the world wouldn't die in absolute poverty.
I think we need to be careful here not to flatten this narrative. It's so tempting when we talk about historical figures who face discrimination to turn them into one-dimensional martyrs. It's easy to just say she was a wronged woman who was entirely ignored and despised by the arrogant men around her. But the historical records tell us it is actually much more complex than that, and honestly, the reality of how she was treated is almost more tragic.
How do you mean? What makes the complexity more tragic?
Well, she wasn't entirely ignored by the individuals in that scientific circle. She was deeply respected by the top scientists of the day on a personal level. Men like Buckland, Lyell, and de la Beche, they knew exactly who she was. They eagerly traveled to Dorset to see her.
True.
They sought her advice on anatomical reconstructions. They openly acknowledged in their letters that her eye was better than theirs. They knew exactly how brilliant she was. Isn't that almost more painful?
That's a really good point.
They knew her worth as an individual, but the system they all belonged to and benefited from simply refused to make a permanent official space for her. They were willing to be her friends, they were willing to buy her fossils, they were even willing to raise charity money for her when she was starving, but they were unwilling or unable to alter the institutional rules that mandated her exclusion from the official scientific record.
That is a vital distinction. It wasn't necessarily individual malice from all quarters. It was the rigid, crushing machinery of the Victorian social structure. Her brilliance was an open secret among the elite, but it was a secret they kept out of the official journals and the institutional roles.
And this brilliant mind, trapped by the inflexible rules of her era, meets a very early end.
Yes. Mary Anning developed breast cancer and died in 1847. She was only 47 years old.
Wow, that's so young.
By the end of her life, her fame was such that she was visited by international dignitaries like the King of Saxony, who wanted to meet the famous fossil woman of Lyme Regis. Yet, she was still struggling financially. However, in an unprecedented move, the Geological Society of London, the very institution that had barred her from entering its doors while she was alive, published a eulogy for her upon her death.
Too little, too late.
The president of the society actually delivered a tribute to her at their annual meeting, reading it into the official minutes. It was an honor they had never before bestowed upon a woman, let alone a working-class dissenter.
It's a nice gesture, but it rings incredibly hollow, doesn't it? You won't let her in the room when she has a pulse and a mind that can help you understand the universe, but you'll read a nice speech over her grave when she's no longer a threat to the social order.
It's a very harsh irony.
There is a quote often attributed to her writings, and again, we have to treat this as an attributed piece of historical memory rather than a verified, signed diary entry, but it feels so deeply resonant with the reality of her life. She is reported to have said that the world used her unkindly and that it made her suspicious of people.
If she did express that sentiment, you can hardly blame her. It perfectly captures the quiet, enduring ache of a brilliant mind constrained by prejudice. She knew exactly what she had found. She knew she understood the comparative anatomy better than the men who were publishing the papers. She knew she was uncovering the deepest, most profound history of the planet, and yet she was forced to stand outside in the cold, both literally on the beach and metaphorically in the scientific community, while others claimed the glory of her intellect.
So as we pull back and look at the sheer scale of what Mary Anning accomplished, the trajectory is breathtaking. We started on a dark, freezing beach with a 12-year-old girl terrified of a landslide, just trying to find a strange rock to sell to buy a loaf of bread. And we end with humanity fundamentally reevaluating its place in the universe, realizing that the Earth is an ancient graveyard of bizarre, vanished monsters, and that the timeline of creation is unimaginably deep.
What is truly fascinating from a geological perspective is that the cliffs at Lyme Regis, the Blue Lias, are still there today,
Right.
and they're still eroding tonight. The winter storms are still clawing the rock away. They're still handing up the dead, still keeping Mary's kind of time. Her legacy isn't just in the physical bones she found, though those specific specimens are housed in the most prestigious museums in London and around the world. Her true legacy is in the expanded reality she forced humanity to accept.
The idea of deep time itself.
Yes, the concept of deep time, the physical reality of extinction, the dizzying realization that the world is incredibly old. She was the vanguard of that intellectual earthquake.
Before we end this deep dive, I want you listening to consider this one final thought. It's a cultural artifact we intentionally held back until the very end. You have almost certainly heard, and probably recited, the famous children's tongue twister. She sells seashells by the seashore.
Oh, it's a ubiquitous part of the English language. Everyone knows it.
Right. Well, many historians and folklorists believe that that specific rhyme, written in the early 20th century, is actually based on the life of Mary Anning. Just let that sink in for a moment. Think about the scale of her contribution.
It's staggering.
The girl who pulled dragons out of the earth, the self-taught genius who handed the human race the incomprehensible depths of deep time and shattered our entire fixed understanding of the planet's history. She came down through popular history, not as a titan of science, not as a household name in the textbooks alongside Isaac Newton or Charles Darwin, but as an anonymous beach vendor in a nursery rhyme.
It really forces you to rethink the origins of the cultural noise we surround ourselves with.
It absolutely does. It makes you wonder. Who else is hiding inside the simple stories we tell ourselves, waiting to be properly unearthed? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the historical records of Mary Anning's incredible life. Stay curious, keep questioning the official narratives, and always, always look a little closer at the ground beneath your feet.